Hello the internet and welcome back to my channel. Today on the bench I have two USB soldering irons, one from Sequre and one from Kaiweets. Now I don't normally do reviews on this channel, mostly because they take quite a lot of time to produce, but some time ago I decided I would only accept items which I actually need in my workshop, and I don't happen to have a portable soldering iron anymore. So when Sequre and Kaiweets approached me and offered to send their soldering irons, I said why not? Now, just to be clear, I've got these items for free from Sequre and Kaiweets, so this is technically a paid review, but I've been very clear with these manufacturers that I would come up with a very honest review, unbiased, and I have final words on what I'm going to say here. So the plan today would be to see what comes with these two irons, and then we'll start testing everything, and then I'll give you my honest review. So, enough me talking, let's take a look at the soldering irons. And this is the Kaiweets soldering iron. It comes with a little lid for protection, so you can have your soldering tip attached and carried around without worrying about it. It comes with a 65 watts power supply, a very chunky and silicone USB-C cable, very cheap I have to say, stand for the tip, 6 soldering tips and the manual. Now the soldering tips, if I understand correctly, they're not like generic standard, so they're only available from Kaiweets or from one of the clones of this soldering iron. I think there is one from 𝗤𝗘𝗘𝗧𝗦, if I'm saying that right, which is more or less the same thing. What I'm trying to say is that I think these 6 tips are the only one available for the iron. You can't get another one from other manufacturer unless there's something available on AliExpress or something. It's the main difference with the Sequre, which is a 245 soldering iron. We'll see that in a second. Now, I was a bit disappointed to see that Kaiweets sent me the, let's call it the European version of the power supply. I'm in the UK, we don't have these sockets, I can't really use it without an adapter, and British sockets and plugs are renowned to be, you know, one of the best in the world in terms of how they're engineered, but also probably the chunkiest available. And when it comes to an adapter, you know, as you can see, this doesn't qualify as portable. You know, I don't know if you agree with me, and it's kind of flimsy, it comes off, you know, pretty easily. I don't really like this. So I got in touch with Kaiweets and I said, look, I got this because I wanted it, I needed it for, you know, my workshop, a portable iron. Can I have the power supply that you're actually going to sell in the UK? So I've got this from Kaiweets, which is, you know, unfortunately chunkier than the original one, even without the plug here. And also it looks like this power supply might have a problem, or maybe the soldering iron has a problem. I'll tell you in a minute. As you can see from these two tips, I've been playing with the soldering iron already, but I'll tell you in a minute. Anyways, we're going to use this power supply for our test. It's another 65 watts power supply, even though the label is a bit unclear, and we'll talk about that in a second. And that is the Kaiweets. So let's fit the tip into the handle, let's plug it up, and we'll see how it works. To insert the tip into the handle, you'll have to remove this little bit here. Fit the tip in and secure with this little thing again. And that's it. The iron has a nice OLED screen. It's pretty simple to read. You can see the current temperature here and the set temperature here on the bottom right. And on top right, the iron is telling you what kind of voltage it's drawing from the power supply. When it comes to voltage, this iron can be powered from 9 to 20 volts. So it can be used with like a power bank if you want it. You need a powerful power bank. These two buttons, as you can imagine, are for setting the temperatures, and the temperature goes up and down in steps of 10 degrees, which I think is fine. You don't need 1 degree resolution, and probably even 5, you know, it's a soldering iron. I think it's totally fine. If you hold the two buttons together, you can get into the settings menu, where you can change a number of options. I mean, it's the usual stuff. It's pretty comprehensive, and, you know, I'm not going to go through all the options, but it's pretty nice. You can calibrate the unit, you can choose whether you are left hand or right hand, and you can also set your slip times and brightness and the voltage which the iron is expecting from the power supply. Now this iron is upgradable, so I did check online and found the latest firmware. Now the thing is, there's no mention of what kind of version this iron is running, so my only way to make sure that it was running the latest version was to flash it again. And yeah, there's a little bit of not the greatest communication between the iron, the software, the website and the menu here. But anyways, I just made sure that this is running the latest firmware. Maybe the upgrade software for this iron is not the most user-friendly, let's call it that way, but it works. You know, it's a soldering iron and chances are maybe the next versions are gonna be better. Now let's check the accuracy out of the box of this iron. I've set the iron to 360 degrees and I've disabled the calibration. Now this thermometer is not the best, as you can see. I would take these readings with a pinch of salt, but hopefully it's going to be accurate enough on this occasion. Well, it says 330, so in theory this thing is 30 degrees off. I'm not too concerned, to be honest, because I think even my JBC came like 20 degrees off out of the box. So, you know, we got a calibration menu. Let's just adjust this and see if that makes things better. So I'm now closest to 360 degrees, but the Kaiweets is actually set to plus 40, which is quite a lot, even though, as I said, even my own JBC is set to plus 20. Is this thermometer really accurate? I do not know, to be honest. I've got my JBC here, which is set to 360 with the calibration that I mentioned, and I'm reading more or less 360, so not sure whether it's my thermometer or this iron is actually so much out of calibration. Now, earlier on I mentioned a potential problem with this power supply, and what happens is that if I power the soldering iron from cold, it looks like there's an issue and the soldering iron is kind of rebooting several times before it actually picks up and reaches temperature. And I'm not sure whether it's an issue with the power supply, maybe not happy with the current surge that the iron is requesting when it's being powered up from cold. All I know is that this one doesn't have this problem, and I tried a different power supply, I think it was even a 45 watts power supply, and it didn't have the problem. So it seems like it's just this model here. Now, as you can imagine, I went back to Kaiweets and asking for some help for something. Unfortunately, I was unable to get an answer. I mean, there was communication, but I couldn't get like a final solution, like we'll send you another one, or no, that's not the one we're sending. Yeah, sorry, we sent one which is not compatible. I do not know. The thing is, honestly, I do not know whether this is the one my viewers from the UK are going to get, whether my power supply is faulty. I do not know. Disappointed with Kaiweets for not being able to provide a final answer. You can come up with your own conclusion, and I'm reporting this to you, and I have no idea whether you're going to get this very power supply or something different. This is the Sequre S69, and as you can see, it comes with a nice semi-rigid pouch, which is nice. It comes with a 65 watts power supply with the proper plug. That's the handle. USB cable, which some fancy connector where you can see all the components inside. It comes with 4 soldering tips, some lead-free solder, and more or less the same stand, which I appreciate. You know, this thing is supposed to be portable, but it's really not great. Now, the major difference between the Sequre and the Kaiweets is that the Sequre is using 245 soldering tips, which are the same used by many other manufacturers, including JBC, Aixun, and if you follow my channel, you might know that I do have a JBC soldering station, so I have a selection of genuine JBC soldering tips, and that's one of the reasons why I accepted to review this unit, because I have quite a lot of soldering tips which I can use with this handle. I'm not sure whether the USB cable is heat resistant. I guess we'll check that in a minute. Now, the handle is pretty nice. It's pretty small. It's much smaller compared to the Kaiweets. So that might be like a good thing. The thing is, I'm not sure that that's necessarily an upside. Well, number one, I have big hands. That's me, obviously. So maybe I do appreciate a bigger handle. Number two, this handle doesn't seem to have anything. One, to prevent the heat from burning your fingers, because I guess, you know, once the tip is inserted, this area here might get a bit hot. And I guess that's why Kaiweets have this rubber thing, and that's why JBC has not one, but two insulation layers here to stop the heat from burning your fingers. The second reason I'm not sure I appreciate that design is that with the Kaiweets it's kind of difficult to touch things which you're not supposed to touch because they're very hot. The same is obviously with the JBC or with any soldering iron. There's always something to stop your finger from going where they're not supposed to go. While with the Sequre, I mean, this design allows you to unintentionally touch things which are not supposed to be touched pretty easily, to be honest. So I guess I haven't tested this yet. I'll give it a go in a minute and I'll let you know what I think about it. The 245 tip is kept in place by friction. It needs a little bit of push and then it stays in place. As the Kaiweets, there is no tool or like silicone mat or anything to just take this out. There's absolutely nothing. There's nothing to unscrew here or anything, so it's a bit faster, but I'm a bit disappointed that there's no, like a small silicone pad or something that you can use or a metal tool or anything just to take out the tip and replace with something else. The next step would be to power this up. I believe there might be an update for the firmware of this thing, and then, you know, we can play with both irons together and see what I like about them and what I don't. Updating the S99 is very simple, though I had to get in touch with Sequre because I couldn't find any instructions online. I can see now the website has been updated. Apparently it's very simple, you just need to hold this button while plugging the soldering iron into a computer. At that point a virtual drive should appear, and then it's just a matter of dragging the file, the update file, onto the soldering, the virtual drive, and the soldering iron would update. I haven't tried this myself, so let's do this together. Let's hold this button and plug this into a computer. There you go, it says update, ready. I guess I can release the button now. And yes, I do have a virtual D drive, which has appeared here, perfect. So I just need to drag and drop the update file. The soldering iron, I guess, is asking me if I want to update, and I'm assuming that yes is going to be this button. Well, apparently yes means it's done, so I should be safe to just unplug the soldering iron and see if that worked. And yes, we now have version 1.07, which is the latest one. There's no tip, so the soldering iron is complaining about it, but the update is now complete. The Sequre was 25 degrees off out of the box, and now I'm really questioning the accuracy of my thermometer. However, I used what seems to be a multi-point calibration, which I think was added with the latest firmware. It was very user-unfriendly to use, but it allowed me to calibrate the iron perfectly. The next step in my review is going to be to use this little tool here, which is pretty impressive. It's a USB tester, and it allows me to record the voltage, the current, and the power that goes through the USB-C cable, basically. So the idea is to see whether the claims the manufacturers are making for the soldering irons are actually true. I've got the Sequre connected to its power supply, which is a 65 watts power supply. What I'd like to find is whether these soldering iron can actually draw the 65 watts that Sequre claim these iron can use. Now this can be checked when the iron is powering up, because obviously it will go at full power for a few seconds while the tip is brought to the set temperature of 350 degrees, and you'll be able to see a graph and some data, because this little device, which is pretty impressive, it's a 𝗏𝗏𝗏, I think I'm saying that right, FNB48, I think it's the S version, the one without Bluetooth. It has tons of options, even too many I'd like to say, but it allows me to monitor everything, including showing you a fancy graph on the screen, because this thing is wired to my laptop through this USB cable here. So the iron right now is stone cold, so I'm going to turn it on in a sec, and we'll check together what kind of power goes through the USB cable into the iron. In 3, 2, 1, go. And looking at the graph, you can see the purple line, which is the power, the wattage going into the iron. And yes, there is a steady delivery around 60-62 watts. The yellow line is the voltage, which is steady at 19-20 volts. So yeah, I would say the soldering iron is definitely doing what Sequre claim it could do. So that is pretty impressive. Now, according to Sequre, this soldering iron can actually deliver up to 150 watts with an appropriate power supply. Now, I haven't got 150 watts power supply, but I do have a 100 watts power supply that belongs to my laptop. So we can definitely check that one. But first, in order to get the more than, I would say, 60, 70 watts out of this soldering iron, you need to have a different type of tip. The tip which is provided by Sequre, it's, I think they call it a 5.5 ohm tip. I'm actually reading 5.5, so that's great. There is a different type of tips, which happen to be my JBC tips, and this one is reading, when it's cold, is reading something about 3.4. I think when it's a bit warm, it's supposed to read about 2.5. So these are called the 2.5 ohms soldering tips, and they're able to take more power. So the iron should be detecting that and allow my 100 watts power supply to actually deliver those 100 watts. At least that's what Sequre say. I would say this is my chunkiest JBC tip. We can plug it into the iron. I'll swap the power supply with my Lenovo power supply, and we'll see whether it actually does what Sequre claims it should do. JBC tip is in, and the 100 watts power supply is also plugged in. 20 volts are coming out of it. Let's turn it on and see what happens. And the Sequre has restarted. I don't even see like a spike in voltage or in current or anything. It just turned off. Now, on the website, when you download the firmware, there's actually a note saying that when using high power tips and high power power supplies, this might happen. It's not very clear. But the good news is that Sequre has implemented a way into the menus to tackle this situation. It's not ideal, but it's nice to have this option somewhere in the menu. So what they recommend is to try and change the protocol or reduce the peak power. So let's try with the peak power and let's set it to 80% instead of 100%. With the peak power limited to 80%, let's try this again. 3, 2, 1, go. And look at that, we got 110 watts peak going into the iron. This is so impressive. You can see that when I started the iron, the delivery was more or less steady around 100 watts. So probably, I mean, my tool says 110, which shouldn't be possible with this power supply. But the point is, this is so impressive that such a small soldering iron can actually deliver this kind of power. And again, it should be able to go up to 150 watts, which is absolutely impressive. I'm gonna repeat the same test with the Kaiweets. Obviously, I have swapped the power supply. There are two 65 watts power supply, but I'm using obviously the Kaiweets one. So let's plug this up. And it doesn't work. Of course, it doesn't work. How is it possible that only when the USB tester is in line, the direction of the USB-C cable is critical for the operation of the irons? Now the iron does not turn on, but if I flip the cable around, it works perfectly. Even turning the USB plug 180 degrees has the same effect. But when the irons are wired directly to their power supplies, the direction of the cable doesn't matter as expected. How? It took me hours to figure this out. So let's plug this up. And let's turn the soldering iron on in 3, 2, 1, go. And yes, the Kaiweets is also able to deliver what they say. I mean, I guess 58 watts or 65 is not the end of the world. In my mind, it qualifies the 65. I can see a very stable and steady deliver of 58 watts going to the soldering iron. Now, this soldering iron doesn't go over this configuration, so this is the best that you can get from the soldering iron. So you can't get like a different tip that goes higher wattage than this one. That being said, let me make a point here. I mean, the fact that the Sequre is going to 100 watts, it doesn't mean that when you're actually using the soldering iron to do some actual soldering, the station is better because it's going to 200 watts. It will never go to 100 watts or whatever. The 100 watts or 150 or 200 watts is definitely a nice thing to have when you turn on the iron. I'm swapping tips on my JBC soldering station all the time, and it's nice to have those few extra watts so it gets to temperature in 4 seconds rather than 10 seconds. But when you're actually soldering, unless you're using something stupidly big, like I've seen something on AliExpress, I mean, those massive tips might be able to use 100% from your soldering iron, but otherwise, in normal situations, you'll never see 100% of power, like 100 watts, going into the soldering tip. So I don't consider the fact that the SEQURE can go to 150 watts like a massive deal compared to the Kaiweets, but it's definitely a nice thing to have because it means that this is going to be faster to warm up. If you have 150 watts power supply, of course, it means it can take bigger tips and deal with them appropriately. It's a nice thing to have. The next step is going to be the coin test. I'm going to solder 10 centimeters of my solder wire onto a copper coin. Now, obviously, this is an unrealistic test. That's not what we do on a regular basis when we're soldering, but it's kind of an extreme representation of a ground plane, let's call it that way. So that should show us pretty well how good these irons and their respective tips are to transfer heat and power onto these big piece of metal. So I'm going to do the Kaiweets, the SEQURE, and also my JBC station with a similar JBC tip, and then I'll put everything in post-production and I'll comment when I see the results. Please ignore the parameter display on the left, the software had frozen, but the graph is still real-time. What I observe from this test is that the Kaiweets seems to be more capable of modulating the power, which jumps between 29 and 32 watts, while the SEQURE seems to just switch the heater on and off as the power jumps between 0 and 60 watts. The JBC, which is many times more expensive than these irons, is beating both irons hands down, thankfully I shall say. But bear in mind that the tips are playing an important role in heat transfer. Not only the JBC has a very expensive genuine JBC tip, but it's also not identical to the other two being tested. Next step is to find out whether these irons are grounded and whether there's any voltage at the tip or any current flowing, leaking from the tip itself. So here I have a ground lead, it's going directly to ground. I got my negative connected to ground, and the multimeter is in resistance mode. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to clip my multimeter probe onto the tip of the iron. It's reading 1.3 mega ohms, which is kind of good news, even though I can see is, like the, let's call it analog indicator, is just jumping up and down. That usually means there's some voltage on the tip. So let's switch the multimeter to DC. And I'm reading around 0, but again, it's jumping up and down, so that's maybe AC, which would make sense. And yes, as kind of expected, I'm actually reading 100 volts at the tip of the soldering iron. Now, you might be thinking, what? There's 100 volts? This is normal. We are talking about a switch-in power supply, which is our USB charger, which is ungrounded, non-grounded, so that means this whole system should not be grounded. Not entirely sure why it's reading 1 point some mega ohms. But it's very normal to find 100 volts on your mobile or your computer, and that's why sometimes you get that tingling sensation when you're touching your computer or your USB cable, that kind of stuff. With switch mode power supplies, this is fairly expected. I think someone said it's because of the little an X1 capacitor in between the primary and the secondary. There's a reason for that, but that's the consequence of it. Now, this doesn't mean that you're going to have 100 volts of electricity flowing through your body or whatever you're soldering. This just means, if I'm not mistaken, that the tip is floating. It's reading 100 volts, and that 100 volts is, let's say, not going anywhere. So let's switch the multimeter into current mode. So I'm now measuring whether there's any current flowing from the tip of the iron to ground, and there's absolutely nothing. If I'm checking DC, there's absolutely nothing, and that's it. I mean, this is going down to milliamps. So the thing is, the tip is floating, it's reading 100 volts, but that voltage is not going anywhere, so it is safe. And I'll explain you in a sec why I'm putting quotes on it. Now the next test is the one I did with the Aixun soldering station. So I have this little speaker here, one lead is connected to ground, the other one I'm going to attach the tip of the soldering iron itself, and if you can hear some noise coming out of the speaker, well, that means there is some current flowing for sure. So let's try that. Now let's try and do the same test while the iron is actually warming up the tip, so there's current flowing into the heating element inside. Now let's do the same test, but while monitoring the current flowing from the tip while it's being warmed up. I need to be careful because I'm gonna melt my little clip here, but let me give it a go. So we got 0 amps now. Let's turn it on. And there is nothing. If you watched my Aixun review some time ago, you might remember that that soldering iron was leaking quite a lot of voltage and quite a lot of current, most importantly. So that is when I condemned the soldering iron. It's been sitting on my desk there because I don't want to use it with anything. Now, this is a different scenario. It's a USB-powered soldering iron. And my understanding is there's no soldering iron, no USB soldering irons available, which are grounded through the USB cable here. I looked into this problem online a bit and I found that the 𝗞𝗔𝗘𝗧𝗦, which I believe is the main competitor of this type of irons, is also not grounded through the USB cable, even though the power supply might be grounded. But the 𝗞𝗔𝗘𝗧𝗦 is allowing the user to ground the tip through some little screws on the body of the soldering iron itself. Now, unfortunately, the SEQURE doesn't have this feature, and the Kaiweets doesn't have that either. The thing with floating soldering iron is, well, number one, even though my multimeter is not reading anything, there's definitely something flowing through my speaker. So there is definitely something going somewhere. Otherwise, you wouldn't have sound. That's just the law of physics. The other thing with an ungrounded soldering iron is that it's going to be floating. And in this case, in particular, you also have this 100 volts coming from the switching mode power supply. It's not going anywhere according to my multimeter, so that's kind of safe. But it means that there could be some electrostatic charge just waiting to go through your circuit, through your component. Does that make this iron dangerous? Yes and no. I mean, there's nothing wrong with these iron heads. They're all like this, more or less. Again, besides the fact that it doesn't have a grounding point, which would be a great addendum. But the thing is, it doesn't mean your boards are going to be destroyed, but it means that the iron might have some charge, some voltage going somewhere at some point. So it can't be 100% safe. And this is the SEQURE, the Kaiweets, and I understand, if I'm not mistaken, please correct me if I'm mistaken because I haven't got it, but I'm reading online, the 𝗞𝗔𝗘𝗧𝗦 is the same unless you ground it through the ground points. So is this going to be a deal breaker? Yes and no. I personally don't like it. I haven't been using either of these irons for my own things because of this reason. I'm just, even if it's 1% possibility or 0.1%, I just don't want to have that chance on something I'm working on, which might be expensive. That being said, I feel that for general use, this is totally fine. Again, the main difference between these and the Aixun is that my multimeter is not reading any current flowing through towards Earth. The speaker is, I'm not sure why this is happening, but the multimeter is not saying anything. So if there is something, it's probably minimum and it's probably mostly safe. Ideally, you want to read 0 volts and no sound, no currents flowing from the iron whatsoever. And that's the case with my JBC soldering iron, which is like 100 times the price of this, of course. But it's also the case with my old Aoyui soldering iron, which is an old-fashioned soldering iron, and it's completely grounded and ESD safe, and you can't measure anything whatsoever, and it's completely safe. Now let's repeat the same test with the Kaiweets. Let's test for grounding. And I'm actually getting a kind of this weird reading of 146 kilo ohms. I'm not sure what it means. I have a feeling that's because there's likely some voltage on this one as well. The multimeter is getting confused. So let's switch to DC first. And there's a little something, but it's jumping, so there's going to be AC. And yes, like the SEQURE, I'm reading 90 volts on this ion. Now this is switched off, so let's switch it on and see if it changes. Yeah, 90 volts, 91 while it's running. However, as with the Secure, if I'm checking for current flowing from the soldering tip to ground, I have absolutely nothing in AC, and I have absolutely nothing in DC. So it's the same situation applies, I would say. I mean, the iron is more or less safe because you don't have any current flowing anywhere. Speaker test for the Kaiweets as well. So yes, the same consideration applies to the Kaiweets. I can hear a little less noise from the speaker. I don't know exactly what that means, but I would say these two ions are behaving exactly the same when it comes to grounding and being ESD safe. Now, while I was browsing online trying to educate myself on this problem, understand exactly what the consequences could be before explaining them to you, I stumbled into this website where a creator was explaining exactly this problem and finding a solution for it. And the solution would be to create a custom USB cable with an extra USB plug which goes into a grounding point, basically. So the idea is ground is coming through the USB cable and reaches the tip of the ion, so suddenly your ion is grounded as it should be. Now, my only concern about this is that I'm not sure that on every soldering ion, the ground or the shielding of the USB-C cable is actually reaching the tip. If I'm checking continuity between the tip and the shield of the USB-C connector here, I actually have direct continuity, so that might work. But if I'm checking on the Secure, the multimeter is reading 6, and I have a feeling that that's going to be like the heating element. On this one is actually supposed to read 5.5, so 6 is probably okay. So I have a feeling that by doing that, you're going to ground something which is not supposed to be grounded. All you need to know for the purpose of this video is that none of these ions are grounded. They're floating, you got voltage at the tips. The voltage doesn't seem to be going anywhere, but is there. So it is something to keep in mind if you're soldering something which is ESD sensitive. While I was looking for the firmware update for the Secure S99, I stumbled into this on the Secure website. There's a little, let's call it like bulletin for this model that says, recommend buyers add capacitance to the PCB of the S99 by themselves. And Secure are basically asking the owners of S99s shipped before April 23rd to open up the soldering ion and add a capacitor to avoid damage, apparently. Now there are some pictures with some explanation, and I believe Secure are offering a free soldering tip in just to say sorry about the hassle of having to do this, because obviously to add an SMD component inside here, number one, you need quite good eyes or a magnifying lens or a microscope, but most importantly, you need a soldering iron, so that could be a problem. Now, let's take a look at what we're talking about. So here's the S99 PCB, and if I understand correctly, the pictures are a bit on the small side on the website. Someone would need to add a capacitor in between these two components. So that's definitely not something for the faint of heart, is it? It's kind of complicated, plus obviously you need a component. You need another soldering iron with, I would say, a pretty small tip. For the average user, I would say this is really not great, not something that you want to read on a website. When I saw the bulletin on the Secure website, at first I was very disappointed. I was like, wait a minute, am I reviewing something which is flawed and broken and I need to fix it, and now I need to tell my viewers, hey, you need to open your iron and fix it? And then I realized something. I mean, mistakes can happen. Everybody can make mistakes. I'm the first one making mistakes. And when you're designing these things can happen. And nowadays, I see more and more businesses, including big companies, sticking their heads in the sand when something like this happens. I've never heard of Secure, so I'm assuming it's a small company. For a company like Secure to just say, look, we have a problem with this revision of the PCB. Here's how you fix it, and here's a little something for you to apologize for the inconvenience. I think it's quite a lot. I think I quite like it. I like the attitude. Now, Yes, I completely appreciate that some of you might not know where to start. Now, I'm not sure what happens if you get in touch with Sequre. They might be able to help you in a different way. I have no idea. But from my point of view, I feel like I can praise Sequre for taking responsibility, write an article on the website, which needs to be improved, by the way. It needs bigger picture. It needs some diagrams. It needs to be clearer than that. That's my feedback to Sequre. I like it. I can't condemn them. Now, first of all, I haven't got this capacitor, so I'll need to buy one. Number two, I think I will release a short separate video on how to fix this. So if someone has the S99, maybe they can rely on my video and see what exactly needs to be done. Meanwhile, if you purchased an S99, just go on the website and make sure that I think the PCB is revision 1.4. That's the affected PCB, and that will need this extra little capacitor piggybacked on those two components. So, do I recommend these irons? Well, I'm not impressed by the fact that they are both not grounded. That's kind of a deal breaker for me. I really like the Sequre shape. It's light and pretty nice. It feels great in your hand. The Kaiweets is a bit chunkier, which could be better if you have big hands like I do. And I do like this rubber thing, this rubber ring around it, which is preventing your fingers from going where they're not supposed to go. I tested this iron for like 20 minutes in a holder, so it was kind of vertical, and the body didn't get hot at all. It was still comfortable to touch, so that was pretty impressive. Now, when it comes to the USB cable, I'm actually pretty disappointed for two reasons. The first one is that this cable is too short. I had to fish out a power extension and just move it on my desk because my sockets are just too far away from where this cable can reach. And the same applies for the Kaiweets, because the Kaiweets is just marginally longer. But most importantly, this cable is not heat resistant. So that should definitely be addressed by Sequre. We need a longer cable, but definitely heat resistance. The Kaiweets cable is a much higher quality. It's a silicone cable. It's a bit chunkier, but anyways, I don't mind. It looks like good quality, but again, it's a bit too short. Now, let me spend a minute about tips. I was reading something online at some point of someone saying, I'm gonna buy this 245 soldering station, and then I'm gonna buy a bucket of these super cheap soldering tips from AliExpress. Now, tips are the heart of your soldering station, your soldering iron. A bad tip will make your soldering experience awful, regardless of how good the soldering iron is behind it, especially when it comes to the 245, because they have the heater and the thermocouple inside, so the handle is really just a controller. Now, when it comes to tips, there's quite a lot of research and development behind them. The materials, the metals, the bonding, it will make a difference. So if you know somewhere on AliExpress where you can buy good 245 or whatever soldering tips that you need for your iron, happy days. I'm not saying that the JBCs are the only ones available, but what I'm trying to say is if you buy something which is $1 worth, probably there's a reason for that. This is one of the Aixun tips that I found with the station I reviewed some time ago, and there you go. One day I just went to extract it from the handle and the front part just detached. So again, you get what you pay for. But in the end, I think I'm pretty happy with both of these irons. Now, if I had to make a decision, I would go with the Sequre, mostly because I have already a JBC soldering station. I have tips, so obviously I can reuse all these tips with the Sequre. But if you don't have 245 tips, which are incredibly expensive from JBC, I think they're about £30 each, it depends which one, of course, you might want to consider the Kaiweets. It comes with a selection of tips, and it's a nice unit anyways. I have to admit I haven't used them too much, particularly because they're not grounded, but in the end I really like them. There's plenty of options, and then it's just a matter of whether you'd rather like the slim version or the more chunkier one if you have bigger hands. I believe Kaiweets is going to send me a link so you can get a discount from their website. If there is, it's down below in the description. And keep an eye on my channel if you're interested about the video on how to bring up to speed or up to specs the Secure by adding that little capacitor. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, as usual, I'd appreciate a thumb up down below, and also don't forget I'm on Twitter and also on Patreon. You can join for free, so there's really no excuse for not joining if you follow my channel, and you can decide at a later stage whether you want to support me or not. But anyways, just watching this video is a great support, leaving a comment is a great support. So anyways, thank you for watching, I wish you a great day, and I hope to see you again soon here on my channel for my next videos. Thank you very much, and goodbye. Bye bye.